started. Good evening, everybody. I'm Andrea Miller. I'm the founding board member and the executive director of Center for Common Ground. Thank you so very much for taking time out of, I know what is your busy schedule, to join us tonight. So a quick update on what's going on with Center for Common Ground. We are waiting for the Florida primary, which will be on August 23rd. Early voting started in all counties will start in all counties on August 13th and run until August 20th. The Florida phone banks are currently running, and Florida will be our last primary. After Florida, we will move on to the general. The first addresses that have already started to go out were in North Carolina, and Georgia is now going out. I'm going to turn this over to Nancy because I am suffering from rural broadband issues where my computer is telling me my bandwidth is exceedingly low. So Nancy and Carrie, if you two would like to finish the postcard report, I'd really appreciate that.
Thank you and good luck with your broadband. So I just posted in chat, we assigned 578,000 addresses to people to write postcards to Black infrequent voters in Florida, and those were mailed already. Virginia, we're doing right now, we have about 260,000, again, Black infrequent voters. That is to say they missed the last midterm. We really want them to turn out for this one. This election, and we're inviting them to do so. So those cards will be mailed starting September 5th. And North Carolina, we have about more than 400,000 voters to write to, again, infrequent Black voters. And those postcards start getting sent out October 13th because their early voting is a bit later. Georgia, we're also actively sending postcards to, writing postcards to 576,000 voters. In all these states, we're writing the postcards now, but we're waiting and not mailing them till about a week before they start early vote, and every state has a different start date for early vote. So our mail date is different for every state. A couple of weeks from now or sooner, we're going to launch with Texas. We've got about 750,000 voters there, and then Florida. And then after that, our other states, which is Arizona, South Carolina, Alabama, and at the very end, Louisiana. So we've got a lot of postcard writing. We've sent out more than 1 million already this year for the primaries. And so we're going to expect to do more than that for the general election. And we're grateful to anyone that can do it. I'm going to post in the chat a link to the results that we've been recently sharing, which is that we've had really good impact. In North Carolina, a couple of years ago, we mailed 309 postcards to people who had been purged from the voting list, Black voters in Onslow County, and 79 of them, which is 26%, registered to vote within a couple of months. Prior to these postcards, they got about 3 people a month voting, registering to vote, re-registering. So it was hugely impactful. And in Georgia in 2020, we sent out hundreds of thousands of postcards, and about over 3%, about 3.3% of the purged voters actually went back and re-registered after they got our postcard, which is great. And then the third data point is we did send out postcards in Virginia last year, in Petersburg, Virginia, and we had a 43% turnout among Black voters that we postcarded compared to a 40% turnout among all Black voters in that community. So that's a good set of impacts. When people ask, did postcards make a difference? We can say, yes, they do. And Carrie just finished revising the postcard video. So that's a live link too.
Carrie, do you want to add anything?
You covered it mostly, but we have a new version of the video and also the guidelines. So if anyone's kind of saving the old version in your computer, just delete that and put a new one in there. And also I think Arizona might be a little sooner than on that list. But yeah, that's it. Everybody, we're thrilled that we got so many postcards out to Florida, over 500,000. So it's definitely going to be making a difference.
Yeah, people love to do it and they love to know it makes a difference because we're reaching out to voters that nobody else reaches out to. The parties just reach out to people who are already who are likely to vote. We reach out to people who aren't likely to vote unless they're invited to vote. And that's what makes a difference.
And then I've got one last announcement. I'm not going to turn my camera on. I've got major bandwidth issues. We did the mobilization launch with Georgia Team Unity, and that was incredibly exciting. And then Virginia, in Northern Virginia with 16 counties, we did that launch last night. And we had 44 people join us. So this year we are seeing a really, really, really wonderful joining of groups in our states to work together as we get ready for Get Out the Vote. So with that, I am going to turn it over to our Connecticut organizer, Carol Rizzolo, to introduce our very special guest tonight. Take it away, Carol.
All right, well, thanks. So we are going to start off with Jay. Jay and William are both, William, I am just thrilled to be able to call you a friend. It's such an, I love it, actually. And Jay, I look forward to a new friendship with you. So Jay Chen, who you're not spotlighted on my screen, but I see you there. Jay is the son of immigrants from Taiwan. He grew up in Southern California, attended local public schools, and graduated with honors from Harvard. He's a lieutenant commander in the United States Naval Reserves and holds a top secret SCI. What's SCI? Security clearance? What does it stand for?
Secret compartmentalized information, I believe.
Thank you. Clearance as an intelligence officer. In 2020, Jay was mobilized to the Middle East to support Operation Inherent Resolve, which was the campaign to defeat ISIS at home. And I'm sorry, to defeat ISIS at home. Jay was recently reelected to a second term on the Board of Trustees for Mount San Antonio Community College. Prior to that, he served 8 years on the Board of Education for Hacienda La Puente Unified School District, which is the largest district in the San Gabriel Valley. He was twice elected board president and was named as a first, Jay's background is a Navy veteran, owner of a small business, local elected official, son of immigrants, and husband and father. And we are delighted to welcome you. But I guess I didn't say anything about a small business. What's your small business?
I'm in real estate.
Ah, there you go. Anyway, Jay, it is a pleasure to meet you, and I look forward to hearing more about you and introducing you to our group.
Thank you. Thank you, Carol, for that introduction and for making this event possible and for inviting me. Thank you, Andrea Miller, and the entire leadership of Center for Common Ground. The work that you're doing to empower voters and encourage participation is so important, especially today, when we see what's at stake. And I'm really glad to see my friend William Tong, who I don't know when's the last time we actually got together, but I recall we were part of a leadership program for Asian Americans, and it was probably over a decade ago. And it's very apt that here we are now as elected officials talking about our experiences as Asian American electeds and our experiences in our respective states. So it's really good to see you, Attorney General. So I'm really excited to talk about the Asian American political experience in California, and I know that there's a lot of questions that will come later on. So I also want to leave room for questions and for you to all hear from the Attorney General. But for me, the Asian American political experience, it's one that's been very fraught. Basically, in California, we know that there were a lot of laws that were passed because people thought that there were too many Asian Americans in the state. And while the Statue of Liberty was always seen as a beacon of hope and a symbol of, of welcoming, on the other side of the coast, we had Angel Island, which was really kind of a prison. So it was a very different experience for those coming across the Pacific. And, the Chinese Americans who came, they contributed a great deal to California's economy, helped build the railroads, but they also inspired a lot of fear from those who thought that they were going to take over. And that's why Leland Stanford, governor of California, he started the anti-Chinese kind of movement. And it's kind of ironic because today Stanford is like over a quarter Asian American, but he was a governor of California, and he pushed forth a lot of these anti-Chinese exclusionary laws. And eventually in 1882, there was a Chinese Exclusion Act, which basically prevented Chinese immigrants from coming over to the United States. And then in 1907, we had the Japanese Gentleman's Agreement, which then excluded the Japanese from coming over. So there have been, a few races that have been targeted as much as Asian Americans in terms of actual legislation to ban them from coming into the United States. And that's part of the history that we have. And of course, we have the Japanese American internment that happened after, during World War II, where over 100,000 Japanese Americans, Americans who happen to have Japanese ancestry, were rounded up and sent to desert camps across the United States. And right here in California, we have still a lot of reminders of that, and they should remain. Even in Santa Ina Racetrack, it's a racetrack in Arcadia. That was where a lot of Japanese American families were first rounded up and then sent off to desert camps like Manzanar. So, that is the difficult history of Asian Americans. But, it was really thanks to the civil rights movement that things started to get better, and Asian Americans began to, seek political power themselves. The civil rights movement that was led by the African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans were part of that as well in the 1960s. Folks like Yuri Kojiyama, an Asian American woman who was very involved in these efforts. And because of that, discriminatory immigration laws were reversed. And it was because those laws were reversed in the 1960s that my parents were able to come to the United States. And before the 60s, we actually had quotas that really strictly limited the number of Asian Americans that could come, Asians that could come to the United States and pursue their futures here. So, so the 60s, that was a big awakening moment. The murder of Vincent Chin in 1982, that was also a formative moment for Asian Americans when a Chinese American was killed by Detroit auto workers who thought that he was Japanese, and they were upset that jobs were being lost to the Japanese due to competition with Japanese automakers. So that's a little bit of the background, a little quick Asian American history. And I'll tell you a little bit about my own personal history. I grew up in Hacienda Heights, and Hacienda Heights is in the San Gabriel Valley. It's known as Little Taiwan. And I arrived in 1988, and that was when the Shilai Temple, Buddhist temple, was built. And the Shilai Temple is the largest Buddhist temple in the Western Hemisphere. But before it could be built, it also faced a great deal of opposition. Folks said, we don't want a temple there. There's going to be animal sacrifices. People are going to be banging gongs at night. And so there was a lot of pushback, but it did get built. And when I was in high school, I remember when Al Gore came to visit the Shilai Temple. And finally, this was like in 1995, it was supposed to be a really joyous moment for the Asian American community. But then Asian Americans who participated and contributed to political campaigns to that campaign were then harassed by the media and the press and were asked, hey, do you have a right to contribute? Are you really an American? So even, today we still see this alienation of those with Asian backgrounds. And we see that with the anti-Asian hate crimes that unfortunately have risen in the last couple of years. We still have not gotten past that kind of xenophobia. And that's why it's so important that we reach out to the Asian American community. That's why it's so important that we have discussions like this, where Center for Common Ground is trying to understand the Asian American political experience so that, we engage Asian American voters and we grow more leaders so that we can have folks like Attorney General William Tong, leading at the state level and we know beyond. So, that's a little bit of my background. I've served on a school board. I've also served on a community college board. And, when I was on the school board, I kind of faced the same thing that, I talked about earlier, we tried to put forth a Chinese language program, and there were folks who said, you can't teach Chinese because teaching Chinese means you're teaching communism, right? So things that you would not think would be said in this day and age, I mean, they're still being said. And unfortunately, sometimes those voices, it seems, are getting louder and louder. So that's why, what we're doing is so important. And there are organizations out there that help to support Asian Americans and get them more involved in politics. APEX is one of them, Asian Pacific American Institute for Congressional Studies. I'm on the advisory board for that and served on the board before. And they try to put young Asian Americans into pipelines of leadership where they can learn from electeds or from internships, what it's like to be in government, and hopefully pursue that path fitted from programs like that, myself. So that's a little bit, about my background and my perspective. And, I just want to thank everyone for giving me this opportunity. And I want to leave plenty of time for the Attorney General to speak and take questions.
Thank you, Jay. It's really interesting to me. And, when you and I spoke before and you spoke about being Taiwanese American and how different that is in campaigning as you're out meeting people. And I will ask you more about that later and kind of that distinction. One of the things we've become very aware of is not painting with a broad brush all Hispanics, all Asians, that each one is really so unique. And of course, the unique background. So thank you. And with that, I think we'll go ahead and introduce my dear friend, Attorney General William Tong, who I am just delighted that you're able to be on this call this time. So, William Tong, 25th Attorney General to serve Connecticut since the office was established by the state constitution in 1897. He took office in January of 2019, first Asian American elected at the state level in Connecticut. General Tong previously practiced for 18 years as a litigator in both state and federal courts. He has served for 12 years as a state rep in the General Assembly here, where he was the House Chairman of Judiciary and the Banking Committee. Son of immigrants and small business owners, he knows firsthand the constant pressure on families and how squeezed by expensive healthcare and prescription drugs, ever-rising utility costs, high cost of housing and education, and lots of other pressures. And one of the things that makes me profoundly proud to support you and to call you a friend is the incredible work that you've been doing with the pharmaceutical companies, serving on leadership committees of the state attorneys general to fight the opioid and addiction crisis on all fronts, to take the Sackler family to task and not settle for whatever their offer was, where they were going to be able to walk off scot-free. And you said, I don't think so. And led an incredible fight to get them, to have them be responsible. It's just, so, I mean, I could go on forever as you.
Yeah,
well
that's
know.
enough. That's enough.
Okay, I'm going to stop. Okay, you're up. Talk. There you go.
It's like a unfair home field when I have Carol Rizzolo here with me.
Yeah, well,
Let me say, first of all, thank you to the center. Thank you, Andrea and Carol and all of you for inviting us to be here. And I want to say a word of apology to my very good friend, Jay Chen, for crashing his event. Jay, I haven't seen you in a long time. I'm rooting for you from Connecticut. I know you're going to be our next congressman from California 45. So I'm really excited for all that you're doing. Jay and I were in a fellowship, probably 10 years ago. And we've both been working hard, and Jay has really distinguished himself in California. So really proud of his work and to call him a friend. So actually, the truth is, Carol asked me for some ideas about questions to ask Jay, and I gave her some ideas, and then she said, okay, you have to be on the Zoom too.
Well, it was sort of like that.
Yeah, sort of like that. I was sort of voluntold that I would be on the Zoom too. So apologize for crashing in. And I do want to get to questions, because that's where I think we'll really dig into some of these issues. But let me pick up on what Jay said for 1 second, because the question I get asked most, I think, in these spaces, and as an Asian American, Pacific Islander, Chinese American elected, and there aren't that many of us. There are a few more in California, but there really aren't that many of us. And there haven't been that many of us in history. particularly in significant roles like the US Congress or in senior state level roles. But I am often asked, you know, what's it like being an Asian American elected official? What does it mean to you? And I want to share a quick story. After I got elected Attorney General in 2018, I joined an association called the Democratic Attorneys General Association. And we work very closely together on all of the big fights that Democratic Attorneys General undertake. And I was invited to a meeting in San Diego where it was just AGs in a room in San Diego. This was the height of when the former president was building his wall. And so we are talking about immigration, immigrants, social justice, all the issues that you would think would be on the table at that time. And we had an eminent lawyer, advocate, leader in the civil rights community come and talk to us. Someone who represents an organization, a national organization that all of us know and I'm sure have helped and contributed to in the past. And the topic of his conversation and presentation to us was the history of hate in this country. And it was an honest, deep dive into not just civil rights and that history, but the history of hate and violence and discrimination in this country. It was a 3-hour presentation, and he went into our nation's history in great depth. I was the only Asian American and Pacific Islander in the room. After 3 hours, by the way, he's African American and very progressive, and I presume we would agree on most things. When he was done, he had to catch a plane. So he had to run out of the conference room where we were listening to this presentation, and I ran after him. And so he gets in an elevator, I get in the elevator with him. And I say, hey, excuse me, can I grab you for a second? And he, recognizing me in my office, said, yes, Mr. Attorney General, how can I help you? I'm trying to catch a plane. And I said, you did a great job over 3 hours talking about the history of hate and discrimination, the civil rights history in this country. He said, well, thank you. And I said, yeah, but over 3 hours, not one word about Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. Not one word about Vincent Chin, Japanese internment. And he just blanched and looked at me with a blank stare and said, oh my God. And I said, yeah. And I said, now you know what it's like to be an Asian American or Pacific Islander in America. To be an AAPI, to be a member of our community is to be invisible in this country, not to be seen, not to be heard, and in our political discourse, not to be counted. And that's where, I think, I'm guessing that Jay will agree with me, and that in many spaces, even our spaces, right? Spaces where we honor each other, respect each other, progressive spaces for a Democrat, even in those spaces, people don't see Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. And I believe that it's because of that, not just because of that we have, less political power than we should, or things happen that shouldn't happen. But I believe that's why 6 Asian American women were murdered in Georgia, because people don't see them. They're in the shadows. They're in the darkness. People don't care to see them or honor them or protect them. And that's why the murderer, the attacker, thought he could get away with it, because in his view, who would care, right? That he murdered 6 Asian American women. And so that's where I think any conversation about AAPIs needs to start. And that's where it starts for me. And I thank you for the opportunity to have this conversation tonight.
Well, thank you. That's an incredibly powerful statement for sure. So because Josie has unstable internet, I'm going to be the one asking the questions. So I think I'll probably start the question off to Jay, and then to William, it'll be the same question. But despite the long history of AAPI in America, especially Taiwanese or Chinese Americans, why have there been so relatively few candidates and elected officials and major state and federals from the AAPI community? Why does it feel like progress has been so slow in this regard?
Yeah, I think, and thank you, William, for that thoughtful story. I think it really highlights, and I completely agree, which is why I want to talk a little bit about that Asian American history, because it's not told very often. But the reason why a lot of Asian Americans don't, run for offices, number one, we don't see ourselves in office. It's kind of like this vicious circle where when you are invisible, you don't believe that you have a place there. And I will say that, a lot of our parents, maybe a lot of them came from countries where being involved in politics was really dangerous. So my parents came from Taiwan, and they left an authoritarian, they left a country that was under martial law, where you could be, disappeared or whatnot by the government if you were not in alignment with them. And folks from, for example, Vietnam and other Asian countries, there's this real fear of getting involved in politics. And when they arrive here in the United States, the first instinct is to just buckle down, build a business, get financial stability, stay away from politics, and go into those safer professions, become a lawyer, a doctor, but keep your head out of politics, because it's seen as a little bit distasteful. I will say that that's kind of the history that we've seen. But then if you compare it to other Asian countries where democracy has taken root much longer, you can see the opposite impact. So we have a lot of South Asians actually who are really involved in politics at the highest levels. For example, Kamala Harris. We have a lot of South Asian members of Congress as well as governors. And I feel like it's because in India, India has been a democracy since the mid 40s, and there is this culture of voting and getting involved. So coming into the United States, it's much easier, much faster to adapt to the system, and so you see increased participation by South Asians. And if there's anyone who, that's my own analysis, but if folks disagree, I'd love to hear their opinions as well. But I think that's one of the reasons why we're coming from countries very often where democracy and politics is just a little bit too dangerous to be participating in. William?
Wow, that's quite a
Thanks, Jay. There are a lot of reasons, obviously, and Jay has hit on one, which I think is really important. I think the failure of people to see us in these roles comes from within the community and outside the community too, and it cuts both ways. And people aren't accustomed to faces like ours being engaged in the political process, and that's a built-in barrier. I think if you're really to dig into it too, I think there's a reticence and a reluctance to talk about our experience for whatever reason. And if you listen to our bios, which came in part from what we wrote ourselves, right? Jay and I both lead with our experience as the sons of immigrants, right? And because that's really important. It's a really important piece of who we are. It's maybe the most important piece of who we are and how we got here, and informs our worldview. I'm the first American in my family. My father was at one point undocumented, nearly deported. Now, back in those days, that wasn't fatal. We had the Immigration and Naturalization Service, INS, not ICE, and we had a much more compassionate view and approach and policy towards immigrants. But I think because of our status as immigrants, and for many people, the insecurity of being an immigrant, sometimes people are afraid to talk about that experience, talk about the experience of growing up as the sons and daughters of small business people, right? How our parents have struggled, financial trouble they may have had, legal trouble they may have had. And the reason why that's so problematic that we don't talk about it is because you don't show people who you are and what you're about, where you come from. But what I've also found is that if Jay and I talk about experience as the sons of immigrants and growing up, I grew up in a Chinese restaurant. So if you go to any takeout joint, you see that like 12-year-old kid behind the counter, like doing his homework and then ringing up your takeout order. That was me. And many people, not just Asian Americans or Pacific Islanders, but many people have that experience. And the more you talk about our experience, the more you find out that people in the Hispanic and Latino community have similar experience, right? Or people in the African American community have similar experience. And I think we haven't, as a community of people, done a good job of telling that story. And I think the more that we do that, the more people see us in these roles and welcome us into leadership positions.
William, if you don't mind, I know you.
I'd like to,
I'm sorry, go
I
ahead.
want to just add on to that a little bit, because I think you hit on a really good point. It's about the stories and having people recognize them. And that's why, politics and entertainment, I believe, are closely intertwined.
Yes.
And if we hadn't seen Morgan Freeman play a Black president so many times, I think it would have been much tougher to have Barack Obama be president, right? And seeing our images tells you, what's possible. And for the Asian American community, we are only now just starting to see ourselves on the big screen. We finally got an Asian American superhero in Shang-Chi. We had an all Asian ensemble with Crazy Rich Asians. And I really think that matters, that, people have to see us, recognize that we're part of the fabric, and then they will accept us as leaders as well. So it's a two-pronged approach. It's, the media and then politics as well.
Fantastically interesting. It's invisible. You're right. And as engaged as I am in everything political, this piece has been invisible until really, William, you and I started speaking a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Next question. And we can again go Jay first and then William to this one. Several people have asked us about this one. The Supreme Court is set to hear oral arguments this fall in 2 cases against Harvard and University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And given the current conservative supermajority, it could overturn another longstanding precedent, being affirmative action. Both cases started in 2014 when Students for Fair Admissions, which is a group that opposes racial preferences, spearheaded the lawsuit that gutted the Voting Rights Act. They sued Harvard and UNC, alleging that their race-conscious admissions process was unconstitutional and discriminated against Asian American students. What are your thoughts? What are your positions on those cases? Jay, why don't you go? Was that too convoluted a question?
No, not at all.
Good.
No, this is this topic is top of mind for many people, particularly Asian Americans. And one of the reasons why Asians immigrate to the United States is for the educational opportunities. So it's because they know we have a great public school system. It's because they want to get their kids into schools like, Harvard, Stanford, Princeton, Berkeley, whatever. We have the best universities. And so I understand the passion behind this when folks feel like their dreams are being threatened. But this lawsuit by Blum, really it's his 3rd or 4th attempt to try to overthrow affirmative action. And we shouldn't see it as him trying to fight for the Asian American community, because he also led a lawsuit, and that was Fisher versus University of Texas, where he had tried to get affirmative action overturned, but the plaintiff at the time was a white woman. He failed. So then now he has found a new avenue to try to contest it. And this isn't really about supporting Asian American students. And that's the one thing that I hope Asian Americans understand, because college admissions, it's tough. Definitely we see the differences in SAT scores and average SAT scores, between Asian applicants and other groups. But, those folks who are talking about affirmative action and how this impacts Asian American students don't talk about all the other ways in which, why is it then that, white students also have, lower test scores? And there's other aspects of this as well. You've got legacy that they don't want to touch. You've got these elite prep school sports, which, as we found, now provide a way for wealthy parents to basically bribe their kids into these elite schools. They don't talk about that. And then just in general, if we talk about Harvard has 42 Division I sports. It brags about how it has the most Division I sports out of any university. But many of these sports are completely out of reach to the average public school student. You talk about field hockey, you talk about crew, lacrosse, sailing. There isn't any student from La Puente where I'm, that I represent, that ever has a chance to compete in those sports and compete for one of those slots that are set aside for students who play those sports. So, this lawsuit, it's not about supporting Asian American students. It's really just an attempt to dismantle affirmative action, and it's primarily going to benefit white students if this happens. It's not, that's really what the aim is, and that's what Blum was working on in the very beginning with Fisher versus University of Texas. So it's unfortunate that now we have a Supreme Court that looks like it's probably going to move in that direction. We've seen affirmative action voted down in California twice, and now that seems to be the direction that this Supreme Court's going, given the way they voted on other issues. But it's also, I want to point out, an effort by the right to try to drive divisions between Asian and Latino and African American communities. That is absolutely what it is. And, I think that is really unfortunate that they're trying to do this, because affirmative action actually, there are ways in which a lot of Asian Americans benefit in hiring, after you graduate from college, hiring practices. There are Southeast Asian students who can benefit from this. And the discussion that they're making is really not nuanced, not nuanced at all, and is aimed at division instead of actually achieving anything for the community.
I agree with all of what Jay said, and it is, from 50,000 feet, an effort to pit communities against each other, and in particular communities of color and communities that have either faced a history of racism and discrimination and hate, or invisibility, or both. My general view about all of these efforts is that they're tragic, and it's a tragedy that Asian American students and families have been convinced that this is how they can fight for their families and do better for their families, when I think, as Jay eloquently said, is really just a fool's errand, right? And it's just built on a mountain of falsehoods. Jay and I, some people have said to me, it's all well and good for you guys to say. Both Jay and I are Ivy League graduates, and we've had amazing opportunities in our lives, but it didn't start that way, and we're the sons of immigrants. And I'm quite sure that we didn't go to the schools that we went to because we had the highest SAT score, or the best grade point averages. Well, maybe Jay did, but I didn't. In our respective high schools, it's because we in our lives had some experience, a richness of our experience, an experience that other people didn't have, that the schools that we went to said, we want that in our community, right? We want Jay to bring that from Hacienda Heights and to share that with other students. We want William to talk about what it was like growing up in a Chinese restaurant and the son of immigrants, and share his experience of his parents and the challenges that they went through. So the fallacy that kids, particularly Asian American kids, would all get into these schools if we would just go based on the merits is a falsehood. It's wrong, because schools use many different metrics to choose the student body that they want, to add a rich, full, diverse education, which frankly inures to my benefit and Jay's benefit today, that we got that kind of experience. So we didn't just go to a math factory. Okay. I mean, our parents wanted us to get a full experience. The other thing I would say is the other two fallacies is this view, sort of this Horatio Alger view, that we all do this alone, and that, just by our own industry and bootstraps. And, if we would just be measured by our individual achievements, everything would be fine, because nobody does this alone. My parents caught so many breaks, so many people, not Asian, by the way, through blocks along the way for them and for me. And we got lucky. And there are families that didn't have the same opportunities. And God bless a system that went out and looked for people like William Tong and Jay Chen and said, those two kids deserve a chance. Let's give them a chance. Because I can tell you, by the way, the final fallacy I want to share is the idea that when Jay and I applied to college, or when we were born, that we started on a level playing field with everybody else is total horseshit. Right? Of course we didn't. And when we applied to college, we didn't. There are people that had more money, more access, more legacy, right? More leverage, more influence than we did. And again, thank goodness there was a system that recognized that, and we and many people like us got an opportunity.
Thanks. So this question kind of really dovetails off of both of what you folks are speaking about. So a lot of AAPIs are immigrants or sons and daughters of immigrants, as you both said. So how has your experiences, well, there are a couple of things. One is impacted your view of immigration policy, but also your relationship with the other immigrant communities. So Jay, you're up first, please.
Yeah, so my parents, they came to the United States from Taiwan. My father had a scholarship to study in Pennsylvania, and then we lived actually throughout the Midwest. I was born in Michigan, moved to Ohio, Indiana, and Oregon. My dad was constantly changing jobs, to try to pursue the best possible opportunity for his family. And eventually we ended up in Los Angeles, which is, the promised land for all immigrants, really, because you can grow up among people who understand you, right? There's so much diversity here, and you can find your pockets here. That's ultimately where they wanted us to live. And but I also know that immigration policy has not always been fair. So my father had that scholarship opportunity, and that's why he was allowed to come to the United States. He was cherry picked, but there are a lot of Taiwanese, who wanted to come to the United States, a lot of Chinese who wanted to come, but because they didn't have the right background and they didn't have the right luck, really, they weren't chosen. So, this also speaks to kind of this model minority myth about, oh, well, Asian Americans are so successful. We have to realize that the immigration system has never been fair, and that there is a lot of cherry picking that takes place. If you were from Europe, you basically, had free reign to come over to the United States for hundreds of years, but then from the Asian side, right, it wasn't that case. And then the experience of Latin Americans is completely different as well. So that's why I think we can't try to look at immigration in a void without understanding what has brought us to this point, and understanding that if immigration was actually fair from the very beginning, the United States wouldn't look like this. It would look very different if things were fair from the beginning. So I think that's what's really important. That's why I really value representing communities of color. So as a school board member and a community college member, I actually represent a district that's 70% Latino. Y hablo español. Hay que hablar español en ese distrito. You have to be able to speak the language. And I love the fact that an Asian American can be seen as someone who can make great decisions for a predominantly Latino community. And I always want to make sure that that I bring my experience to bear, and that I have that empathy. And I remember my own background. I remember the benefits that I've received, and that those benefits not everybody has them, and that the system has not been fair to everyone. And we always have to keep that in mind when we're making policy.
So that's absolutely true. And being an Asian American and the son of immigrants, as I've said before, it's really a defining feature and experience of who I am. And I think Jay would say the same thing. And I think at various points, especially when I was younger, I might have indulged a little bit the mythology, right? And the model mythology that, my parents came here and they worked extraordinarily hard and they opened a Chinese restaurant. We made it, right? And what a great country. But you see and learn things along the way that so many things contribute to that, not just your own hard work and industry. And if life had just been a little bit different, 5 degrees to the right or to the left, I wouldn't be sitting here tonight. And it really came into focus for me. In 2017, there was a Chinese family of North Korean descent, by the way, in Connecticut. They own a nail salon, and they were targeted, and they were going to be deported. They were going to be deported. They're called they were the Huang family. Carol, you may remember the Huangs, but they lived in Farmington. They were going to be deported, presumably back to China and then back to North Korea. And they had 2 boys. They have 2 boys, and their story made the local news and sort of the regional New York area news. And my sister is a journalist, and she saw their article in a local paper, and she sent me a link to the article by text with a simple message: that could easily be us. And I think you just have to remember that, that those of us who are the sons and daughters of immigrants, people who survived the war of Japanese aggression or the Holocaust, or any other tragedy that humanity has visited upon each other over the past 50, 100 years. So many of us, if life had not turned out just so, would not be where we are today. And I'm reminded that, and I think Jay feels this too, don't tell me about a model minority myth. Walk down any Chinatown, any Koreatown, any area in which ethnic and racial minorities are clustered, and where there isn't the same opportunity there is in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Okay. And you will see a lot of people who look like us who are struggling and suffering and who aren't going to make it. And no matter how hard their kids work. And that's the reality. And that's what we fight for every single day.
Thanks. I may speak for everybody in this, but I will certainly say this is just a fascinating conversation. I am just really enjoying hearing each one of you answering some of these questions. So we are a voting rights organization, right? It's what we do. And so the question is, how have voting rights organizations communicated with AAPI voters, and how could we be doing better? And I remember, Jay, when you and I spoke, that one of the first things you say to everybody is, I'm Taiwanese American, particularly when you are speaking to, for example, the Vietnamese community, right? That there's these sort of, in the Vietnamese, you were saying to me, the Vietnamese wouldn't necessarily vote for somebody who's Chinese because of the fear of communism. And you kind of alluded to that at the start, right? So what are your suggestions, and what are the ways that we could do better as far as reaching out to AAPI voters at both? We've got both sides of the country represented here between each of you.
Mhm. Yeah, I think it is, it's fundamentally, number one, I mean, you're doing it now by seeing the Asian American community, but then recognizing that even within the Asian American community, you have substantial differences in experiences that will inform their worldview. So recognizing that, a message that goes to the Taiwanese community may not resonate with the Korean community, and devoting those resources to actually understanding these communities and meeting them where they are. So for, we alluded to this before, for the Vietnamese community, especially for the first generation, many of them have a fear of communism. So recognizing, sorry, I need some water. William, why don't you go first?
I'm going to agree with Jay. Meet people where they are. Don't just invite them to join you. Go to them. Go to ethnic communities. Go to places where most people look like us and not like you, right? And you don't engage in the civic life of those places, right? And invite people to participate. And I think people need to be invited in and brought in, and it's more affirmative than just saying all are welcome, at our meeting. Go to their meeting, and I know that sort of sounds abstract, but you'd be surprised, at how many people are afraid to go into ethnic communities and just be with them and break bread. And so for me, as an elected official, it's easy. I have an issue, right? I can go talk about something, right? I can go talk about immigration. I can go talk about the opioid and addiction crisis, right? I can talk about how bad our state utilities are and get people all pumped up. And I think you can do the same. You can go into these communities and have a forum or discussion. You have to find a host and somebody who will bring you in, but go and meet people where they are.
Thanks. And actually, Jay, well, I also just want to highlight, I mean, I know we are not we can't speak about your candidacy, and obviously we are a C3, but I'm also aware that you're running against a Korean woman. Isn't that correct? And so
That's right.
I just would like you to speak for a moment about that, right? A Taiwanese American is running against a Korean American, opposite parties, different genders, but how is that impacting your rate? I mean, how does that impact what the conversations in general?
Yeah, I think that's been the point that the media has really fixated on, the fact that you have a Taiwanese American running against a Korean American in a predominantly Vietnamese American seat. And the way I see it is like, this is great. This is one thing I can say, is that it speaks to the political maturity of our community, that now the top two candidates in this district, which is 5%, 40% AAPI, not majority Asian, but sizable enough, and the leading candidates are both Asian American, and in the neighboring district as well. It's a South Asian versus a Korean American. So I think it's a great thing that we're at this point where the major party candidates can both be Asian American, and hopefully it no longer becomes a story. Because I'll tell you, all the press, that's the first thing they talk about. And I think, fine, it's interesting, but the bottom line is, it's not enough to just be Asian. Just because you're Korean doesn't mean that you understand or you're going to fight for the needs of your community. Like, for example, the Korean community, next to the Latino community, is the largest recipient of, has the largest population of dreamers. So, DACA is and should be a big deal. And members of Congress should, if they want to represent that community, be supporting the dreamers and DACA. And just because you're Asian, doesn't mean you will. And, that's what we're seeing in this campaign. So it's about more than just having that face. And also, there is a tendency right now for Asian Americans, Asian voters, to vote for the Asian candidate, because if they haven't really been involved for very long and they just see, oh, there's an Asian name, I'm going to vote for it. That's kind of like the first phase, but it's about educating them and letting them know, look, there's more to it than that. You don't want to vote for someone just because of their last name if they're going to vote against your interests. So letting them know how that will actually impact them in the long run, right? It's not just about representation, it's about what they're actually going to do. And that's what we're focused on.
Yeah, I know we're running out of time. Let me just echo that, and thank you, Jay, for sharing those statistics. Our version of it out here is, the poorest racial and ethnic groups in New York City are Asian Americans, and people don't know that. They don't realize that, and are very surprised to hear that. The one thing I will say is, Jay was being kind and politic because of his race. So Jay and I see the world in certain ways, in the same way, because we had similar experiences, not the same, but similar experiences, and we came to similar conclusions, which is why we're Democrats and progressives. We know that we didn't do it alone. We know that government can play a big role in empowering and uplifting people. We know that we depend on community, and that we need each other. And that we're invested in each other, and that's why we're who we are. There are my Republican friends who are Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, and there are a couple of Republican electeds in Connecticut. They had the same experiences, the same successes and triumphs, the same trauma, right? The same hate and discrimination that they faced. But they came to totally different conclusions. right? And with respect, they're wrong. You know, their conclusions are wrong. Their conclusions are that they did it themselves. They don't need anybody else. If they would just be judged based on their test scores, you know, everything would be great. And, you know, other communities of color don't make it because they don't work as hard as we do. I mean, all of those conclusions, which are dead wrong, because there are so many people that look like us that don't make it, as I've said many times tonight. So I think that's the difference probably between Jay and Congresswoman Steele, is that in my view, Jay took the cumulative weight of his experience and came to the right conclusions about what he should do and how he should serve. And she came to the wrong ones.
Well,
I
I'm gonna
just
let
want to
Andrea,
say,
sorry, I'm gonna let
yeah,
Andrea
I've
close it
got it.
out. But Okay, go for it.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think I just did an
Carol.
ad for Jay.
All
Thank
right,
you.
yeah, and that was great. I just want to say, gentlemen, that it was a delight. I had said earlier, I think, before you both came on, that we wanted to have an opportunity to be flies on the wall in this conversation, and it was incredible. It really made me remember some of my experiences. I probably have 20 years on you, Attorney General Tong, and I probably got 30 to almost 40 on you, Mr. Chen. But it is still in many ways sad to see, no matter how much things change, there are some things that just still remain the same, that people are just determined to look at where you come from or skin color, and decide you are less than. So thank you so very, 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 very much. And have a wonderful evening. This conversation has been recorded, and I know that I will be listening to it several more times. It was thought-provoking, it was painful, it was fun, it was funny, and I'm old, I'm evil, I am not very easily moved, and I was moved.
Thank
So,
you.
gentlemen, thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Have a good
you.
night.
Thank you
Take
for this
care,
opportunity.
everybody. Good night, everybody.